Welcome everyone to today's session of the Metaverse and the privacy issues that it raises. My name is Leonie Parr. I'm a partner in the tech and data team here at Field Fisher, and I'm joined today by Lorna Cropper, a director in the team, Natalie Barnfield, also a director in the team, and Jack Hodkinson, a solicitor in the team. Just to say at the outset, there's no one established definition about what the Metaverse actually means. But for the purposes of today's session, we're going to focus on the concept of the metaverse as the expansion of digital experiences via an immersive headset that extends reality, whether that be virtual reality, consisting of environments solely generated by computers, augmented reality, the imprinting of digital images onto the real world, or some form of mixed reality, a blend of the digital world with the physical world by way of holograms. And in particular, today's session will look at how the metaverse is developing and the privacy issues that are being raised. And we'll explore whether those are more of the same issues or whether they're new issues. Now, we certainly won't be purporting to cover all of the potential privacy issues. And in fact, the ones that we do touch on, you'll see are largely magnifications of issues that exist today in the 2D world. But we'll look in particular at what you need to be considering if you or your organization are starting to embrace or considering having a presence in the metaverse. More particularly then, in terms of an agenda, we will look initially at, in a bit more detail about what we mean by the metaverse for the purposes of this session, and Jack will deal with demystifying some aspects of the metaverse. And in terms of privacy issues, we're going to focus on metaverse technologies and the particular privacy challenges that those metaverse technologies raise. We'll explore the traditional concepts of controller and processor and how that fits with the metaverse, and in particular stakeholder accountability and responsibility within the metaverse. We'll explore some issues arising in the context of privacy by design, in particularly insofar as they relate to the metaverse technologies. And we'll also explore some of the challenges posed by the need to be transparent, and also some opportunities that also arise in relation to being transparent from a privacy perspective. More broadly, we'll deal with some of the practical challenges that arise from a privacy perspective. And then finally, you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions at the end of the session. So I would ask you to hold your questions till then, please. So at that point, I would like to hand over to Jack, who's going to demystify the metaverse for us. Jack.
Thank you. Yeah, so before we dive into some of the deeper topics, we think it's helpful to start with some of the basics and really demystify some of the concepts surrounding the metaverse and actually clarify what we mean by the metaverse. So as you'll hear throughout the webinar, in very simple terms, the metaverse is the internet, but in 3D. It's a place where you can and will be able to interact virtually, whether this is a place for entertainment, commerce, making connections, or for business and industry as well. Many of the components of the metaverse are already here today and in use today as well. The ability to connect digitally, whether in 2D or 3D, via immersive worlds, gaming experiences, and online avatars will be familiar to many. The more these ingredients intertwine and bring together a single 3D digital experience, the closer we get to an actual metaverse. Now, when we say the word metaverse, the actual concept has been around for a while. It was been about 30 years when the term was first thought to have been used in 1992, and it comes from a science fiction novel called Snow Crash, which, like today, people use digital avatars to explore and escape the world online. Now, people often have a very specific example in mind when people say the word metaverse, but in reality, many tech companies, both large and small, are working on building tech related to and interacting with online worlds. You may be familiar with examples such as Microsoft, Meta, Nvidia, and Roblox, to name a few. There are some exciting but data-intensive proposals for the metaverse, ranging from the world of work, retail, healthcare, and manufacturing. And we're here today to discuss some of the privacy concerns it raises, which, like the internet's broad application today, there are many.
Thanks, Jack. So I'm going to talk now about some of the technologies powering the metaverse and some of the big picture aspirations for the metaverse of the future, and then think about some of the privacy challenges that they bring. So as Leonie's already mentioned, there isn't yet one all-encompassing definition of the metaverse, and there isn't one all-encompassing metaverse itself. It's generally understood as this immersive digital world where users can live, socialize, work, and play as they would, just as they would in the physical world. And it's certainly the case that for some, the ultimate objective is for there to be one all-encompassing and interoperable metaverse in which users can freely move between different metaverses or different, digital worlds using what's often been referred to as a self-sovereign identity based on, blockchain or distributed ledger technologies. The idea or the concept is that users can use this identity to freely move between metaverses, perhaps taking items that they've purchased in one metaverse with them to wear, use, or play in another without having to, log in with different credentials at each different stage. The concept of this self-sovereign identity is almost like, I suppose, the next generation of the Google single sign-on or similar, but it's just not specifically reliant on one individual identity provider like Google. It essentially underpins all of your metaverse interactions, but it also has the benefit of avoiding unnecessary duplication of data and is arguably more secure due to its reliance on these distributed ledger technologies. But while these are the big future objectives for one unified and interoperable metaverse, for the time being, we should really be talking about metaverses because there are currently different types of metaverses being developed by different providers, which all work and operate differently, as we've already heard. Largely, they're built using these new and innovative, often coined as Web3 technologies, such as those that I've listed on the slide here. So, blockchain or distributed ledgers, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, digital currencies and NFTs, augmented realities, all of these newish, but not completely novel technologies. In very general terms, though, metaverses are currently talked of as being either centralized or decentralized. And in very general terms, again, centralized metaverses are essentially sort of thought of as quite closed environments. So they might be provided and ultimately controlled by one central entity. And while these closed environments might be reliant on the use of the types of distributed and therefore slightly decentralized ledger technologies, these are likely to be operated privately or on at least a permissioned basis, and therefore does give some, central oversight by one particular entity. By contrast to that, this concept of a decentralized metaverse, they're thought of to be more open environments, which are positioned as being user-owned. They give users more control of their data and their environments. And again, they have no sort of central oversight or specific ownership by one main entity. Often in decentralized metaverses, users can be free to code and actually sort of develop and architect the metaverses that they operate in. Next slide, please, Leonie. So it's important to understand these key sort of underpinning concepts, ideologies, and technologies, because they obviously pose some pretty fundamental privacy and data protection questions from the outset of our thinking. Perhaps the most pertinent of which is, who's the controller here? Who's ultimately responsible for all of these GDPR obligations, for all of the processing of this data and the security of data that's processed in the metaverse? And while the answer to that question might be pretty clear-cut for the likes of centralized metaverses, in genuinely decentralized metaverses of the future, which are perhaps based on more decentralized distributed ledgers or public blockchains, in which users can code and contribute to the architecture of the metaverse and in which there is little or no, central oversight, the answer to that question is likely to be less clear. That is, even though data protection regulators might see that quite differently and continue to take an ever expansive view of who is the controller. And then even if it is clear to identify a controller, perhaps we think of it as being the metaverse provider. In this, interoperable environment of the future, it's likely to be very challenging to determine where the obligations of one metaverse provider ends and another begins. And you can then imagine there being significant challenges around the papering of that. And I think my colleague is going to talk a little bit more of that later in the slides. There are then also inherent challenges with the use of, the likes of blockchain or distributed ledger technologies, which many of you, I'm sure, will already be familiar with. But the recording of any personal data or online digital identifiers on recording that on an immutable ledger presents really significant data protection challenges, because it's almost impossible to imagine being able to give effect to data subject rights in respect of data that might be, whether deliberately or inadvertently, recorded on a immutable ledger. And then there's also the question of who would be responsible for giving effect to that. And then similarly, how on earth would you maintain oversight of data transfers of personal data that might be recorded on a public blockchain, where where those blockchains are verified and written by miners located all over the world? These are really difficult challenges. So the obvious solution to that is to ensure that there's no personal data or digital identifiers that are recorded or have the capacity to be recorded on these ledgers. So thinking about ensuring that any personal data or identifiers, they're actually kept off the ledger, and the only things that are sort of recorded on the ledger might be some sort of hash or key that connects to the personal data living somewhere else, so that in the event that you have access or deletion requests, you have the ability to simply sever the connection between the two. But all of these issues have to, of course, be thought through from the outset of design and architecture to ensure that there's no issues down the line. Then finally, we've obviously got to think about the use of hardware. Augmented reality and virtual reality usually requires, at the moment at least, use of headsets, glasses or similar. And this will inevitably involve the collection of significant volumes of data, much of which has the potential to constitute special categories of data, and some of which will inevitably be shared with metaverse providers and beyond for a variety of purposes. So just to give you an example, some hardware used to access metaverses might include motion tracking to enable you to, enable your avatar, I should say, to mimic your movements. It might also involve the collection of data about your personal surroundings to enable you to physically move around your metaverse without, tripping over your bed or your bedroom chairs, for example. It might also involve tracking eye and facial expressions, whether to identify you uniquely or to enable your avatar to maybe mimic your expressions. And all of this data will allow unique identification of an individual, and if it's used for those purposes, will of course constitute biometric data and therefore constitute special category data. I've actually even recently read of ultrasonic signals being used in headphones to uniquely identify individuals by means of the shape of their ear canals, quite interestingly. Slight aside there. Worryingly, this type of data could, if misused, could be used to create digital replicas. So you may have seen videos of deep fakes, I think they're referred to, fake videos of celebrities which essentially look very much like the real thing. So that's obviously going to be a concern. Eye tracking and facial expressions are also going to be very interesting proposition and of significant interest to providers and advertisers who might want to understand what your interests are and your reaction to things in the metaverses. that's going to be very useful for the likes of profiling, advertising, and ultimately monetization purposes. And of course, whenever you're collecting something that constitutes special category data, as I've sort of outlined this might include, that's going to give rise to considerations such as, carrying out DPIAs, whether or not you need to obtain explicit consent, how you satisfy heightened transparency, and also ensure appropriate security.
Thank you very much for that, Natalie, and those insights, which most comprehensive and give us a lot of thought. So just moving on to the perhaps more familiar day-to-day issues that we're faced with, and look within data protection and seeing how these existing areas may help us grapple with the new issues that we will potentially face when all the data collection is magnetized to somewhat infinitesimal amounts. Apparently, again, we have been doing our background reading and research and podcasts, and whilst Natalie was referring to ear canals, I was reading myself, or actually it was a podcast I heard, but how there will be 20 times as much data as today in 10 years' time if the metaverse continues to grow and develop as projected. So where all that data is going to be stored is another question. And it's very exciting about the possibilities that are out there, and as we know and appreciate data protection today, it's a very fast moving discipline, and lots is happening on a day-to-day basis. So the applicable data protection law, it will be similarly patchworked amongst the metaverse, no doubt. Whilst there has been call for one data protection applicable law, which would be most ideal, then regulators are not wanting this. So that's a non-starter. Of course, there'd be lots of jurisdictional problems too. And again, who would be the collective administrator of that? So it will be a matter of mapping what data is collected. Yes, there is the potential for decentralized metaverses where the data subject is more in control, but given business models and how data may be collected or how users may use the metaverse, and on a user-centric base, it will be, yes, that I'm still quite happy on the accountability slide. I've gone slightly off piece because I wanted to bring in an example of how, for me, I would like to use the metaverse just to say, what outfit should I wear today? So just taking that example, would my, devices, my, all interconnected technology need to know the whole contents of my wardrobe, my accessories, my handbags, to create, my potential avatar and show me what that could look like? And just say, for example, I wanted to, have some new fashion, would then I be able to have that delivered by obviously coming out of the metaverse, but I could maybe order that at the touch of a button within the metaverse. So that would be my objective. But again, where would all my data be collected? Who would be collecting it? But there's clear awareness that there will be a lot of data on there. Equally, what happens, if I'm buying from overseas, and also it's, in this global environment we are most definitely in, it's quite conceivable, but that there will be such data going everywhere around the globe. So again, data mapping will be extremely important. It's almost like the rudiments of data protection will be all the more important to build on, and that is what will be very important as we start, or potentially Web3 starts from scratch. Whilst it's not tearing up certain aspects of the internet as we know it, there is a lot of material out there suggesting things could be done better with respect to putting the user more in control of their data. So again, identifying the parties. Interestingly, could we move away from the concept of a controller if the individual themselves is the one in control? But then it is conceivable that the data subject, even if they were going to be controlling their data, will want to share their data with organizations and companies who can enhance the existence and environment. So, as we've often said, data protection can be a competitive differentiator, and it will be important for brands to have a data protection strategy that matches their level of data protection compliance, and also to enable that consumer trust, given how the ownership of data may well be transferred. Will there be any room for processors? Will, in the sense that today already we're seeing so many processors will also be controllers of different parts of the data set? Is there a true processing relationship going on? And similarly, will controllers be independent or joint? And it's quite conceivable that there will be a lot of joint processing and collection going, joint controllership being there. So I think it's a great time for the data protection principles to be very grounded, and whilst accountability is part of those in Article 5.2, it's a sense of upholding all those accountability or all the lawful bases, and then making sure, and the principles, and making sure that accountability is in place. For interoperability, if you're going to be moving between the metaverses, and say, for example, there may be a centralized system, and as we've heard from Jack, there is a lot of investment going into the metaverse, and many big tech companies are developing different metaverses and different technology already, and different ecosystems. It may well be that data is contained within those. But say, for example, I wanted to move my avatar from one space to another, to perhaps there's, as within the real world, there may be certain brands within one metaverse, and I may want to purchase clothing brands from another. So how, where things will be placed within the metaverse, but then I want to be able to use my avatar. So when then maybe I will need to give my data to other companies within that. So definitely where data sharing is taking place, there will need to be some comprehensive agreements in place, and identifying those stakeholders as well, because the conditions will need to be met, and how they will be met. So say, for example, at present, if you are collecting data and taking it not directly from the data subject, you need to give them notice when that's going, as soon as that's going to start happening. So I'm sure Jack will have some innovative explanations on transparency for us later in the session. But it may be increasingly difficult to see how these things will pan out, and that's why the conversation and the dialogues need to be happening now. If I may have the next slide now, Leonie, please. So data protection by design and by default is perhaps the key here. There's an awful lot of creation and design going on at the moment, and there are a number of initiatives now for designers and engineers, creators and developers where data protection is being taught alongside certain courses. And I appreciate that some developers are very intelligent and creative and are actually self-taught. So hopefully there's a Creative Commons out there where there is an awareness of data protection too, in the sense that the design and of it is running through from the outset. And this is why it's going to be so important for the objectives of Web3, the metaverse, and the potential of decentralization to happen. And one of those things, as we were hearing from Natalie, will be how the individual can take control by those ledgers and NFTs and blockchain and such like. So the design and default and throughout the life of the design of the products will be key here, and will be very much the responsibility of those developing and interweaving design and default throughout. And again, just ensuring those principles are upheld. And as I've already touched on, it is the consumer trust that will be very important, because there are so many benefits that using and analyzing data can bring. And in the sense of the different biometrics that can be used for good and and health, and despite the level of data that could be collected, if there's a trust there, people are more so willing, the research is showing, to give that data as well. So by ensuring that the data protection is built in by design and default will enhance that level of trust. And similarly, it will be interesting to see, the level of technical and organizational measures that are designed within as well, and how data is protected. So lots that are going on, and much to think about in complying. And the bases are there, but there's a lot to be thought about as well as to how it will work and develop. But by taking this approach at the outset and knowing the potential downside of what has happened with the internet with models at the moment, there's very much a very clean starting point for data protection and who owns the data. Thank you. Next slide. Over to Jack, perhaps, I believe. Yes, thank you,
Yeah.
Jack.
Thank you. So businesses using the metaverse, whether this is as participants or as providers of virtual platforms themselves, will need to think really carefully about the privacy implications of using these technologies. As you can tell from the slide, one particular interesting area is that of transparency. And here in the metaverse, there are both challenges and opportunities for transparency. On the opportunity side, we're just now beginning to see organizations exploring the use of graphics and videos to provide users or data subjects with information about how their personal data is processed, and to ensure this information is readily accessible to them. In the Internet of the future, perhaps we'll all be exploring virtual privacy notices and cookie banners in a 3D form, although this is not quite clear cut how it's going to be handled yet. On the challenges side, use of these immersive spaces is likely to create large amounts of information, whether this be through platform providers, employers, advertisers, and other providers, depending on the degree of information that they're handling. These people will be able to learn lots more about us, our interests, our behavioral patterns, and so on. And these new technologies will also enable constant monitoring, deeper profiling, and either outright meaning biometric, or implied special category data, bringing into consideration new things such as eye tracking and emotions and things like that. There'll likely be a challenge ahead for companies working with these technologies to clearly understand and explain how personal data is being collected and shared and for what purposes, which will be challenging from both a fairness and, if applicable, consent-based perspective. The immersiveness and interactivity of the metaverse will also likely mean there will be a complex web of technologies, integrations with third-party providers, and this will lead to a really complex controller, processor, and joint controller relationships, as mentioned by Lorna previously. It will likely require a lot of analysis for companies to understand the full picture of how the data they collect, send, and receive from these virtual platforms, who they share it with, and how it is sufficiently protected, including when it is transmitted internationally to technology providers and other participants in this virtual environment. Effectively, the question will be one of where does the responsibility lie? In a decentralized metaverse model, where does one controller end and the other one begin? And this remains to be seen. So I think we're handing back over to Lorna, who's going to discuss some of the practical challenges of the metaverse.
Thanks very much, Jack. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to those 3D all-encompassing privacy notices where I can touch things and I can visually see where all my data is going, who actually knows my data, how it's interconnected, and what those processes are. I think that's, it's going to be quite wonderful if that's ever achieved. But we still have so many static written notices, so I think the challenge is thrown down as well to lawyers to be creative and to go with this process and be collaborative. I think it's going to be a very collaborative process, the metaverse. So it's interesting, there are challenges, and it is, conceivable that, many businesses will start to think about where are they going to sit within the metaverse. Whilst it's such early days, if you think it was only 2007 when Apple launched its first iPhone, and look where we are 15 years later. So I kind of see that could be an exponential trajectory. And, will our hybrid offices be a hybrid within the virtual and the real world in future? So I think it is, if you are a innovative company, certainly to start thinking about where you would sit within the metaverses, and are you going to be collaborating with a more centralized metaverse operator, or are you going to go for that decentralized position? What suits with your own strategy and values more in the present as well? So I think, as well as we've discussed, there will be a lot of intimate data collected, and the collective biometric data, will that data sit on headsets and users offer that to companies to then analyze for the benefit of a more personalized service to them? Or will that also be a way that you can collect that and share that data with other third parties operating as we kind of do today, and that would happen in a centralized metaverse? And it is very interesting as to how that level of data will be used. I think certainly with advertising, and anyone involved in targeted advertising will be following the market and the regulatory activity there, which is again fast moving. And we are seeing a lot of changes and potential changes with towards behavioral advertising and how that may become more contextual. And I was just thinking, how would I most like the metaverse? So you've heard about my example of, the outfits for special occasions, outfits for day to day, smart casual. And then I was also thinking how it would be wonderful to go to a large outdoor music festival, but have that in the metaverse and not be standing in a field of 100,000 people, but perhaps have my own exclusive little set within the metaverse where there's only maybe 20 people, but that big band and that big stage are playing to me. And I'm not necessarily specifying one particular outdoor festival. There are many, both in the UK and around the world. So, but I think those are the potentials. But then would I be paying for that? But then, and would I equally, though, be shown visual advertising within that music festival I'm attending in the virtual world? So I think certainly that advertising, how advertising will work, how payment will work, and the monetization of the metaverse is very much undecided or undetermined, but there is significant potential. Equally, as we've seen with the film industry, there's a lot of product placement. So similarly, there could be a lot of product placement in the metaverse, and maybe certain products that I like to use and perhaps will pay for in the metaverse virtually, would I want in also in the real world? And again, at the press of a button, will those be able to arrive at my physical door? But equally, I could buy them as well. And not to mention that my brain waves may also be collected and those brain waves analyzed to see how my interest is in those new products that are being shown to me. So the possibilities are quite endless once you start thinking about it. And as we heard at the outset, the privacy issues that we're all dealing with today will be magnified, and those biometric data, as we've heard, and we've heard from not only the hearing and facial recognition, fingerprinting, and how one's gait and how one moves is also research from America is showing is as individual. So your movement with devices, hand devices and headsets is so individual. It is akin to a fingerprint, apparently. So the bodily movement and the eye motion, it is quite incredible how much, again, data can be collected and where will this be stored. Safeguarding, as many will already know, is a high priority area for governments and regulators around the world. We have the Digital Safety or Digital Services Act, and also the Online Safety in the UK already being built. And so also children too are of particular importance, and there are already regulators. We know the ICO is already looking at the potential harms to children within the metaverse. And given the deeper and more extensive digital social interactions, which can be extremely positive, that there is certain concerns that there will always be vulnerabilities. And equally, whilst the blockchain can be extremely secure, how open to fraud and malactors is this technology as well? So certainly, again, identity theft and deep fakes. And for anyone who hasn't watched the iPlayer series or the BBC series now available on iPlayer, Capture brings the deep fake world to a very palatable imagination. So it's very clear how these things can work and happen. So I think it's a matter of us all educating ourselves as well into the differences between, authenticity and potential deep fakes. And which does come to the final bullet point, but by no means final in itself, because again, building on trust and brand, ethics is extremely important, as we're seeing with AI as well. So ethics and what the ethics of using things and how the data is used, and different ways in which it is used, and how it's used, and how it's shared, and how it's integrated, will be extremely important. And whilst ethics has not always necessarily been built into the bottom line of commercial companies, I think there is a greater awareness and understanding of that, and certainly those creating the metaverse and working on that are also looking into how it can be done ethically. So I think they're just certainly some of the challenges we're going to see. And of course as well, those product placements and the level of influencing as well, and how that could happen, and certainly just the different biometrics. It is quite almost mind-blowing once you start to think about how much will be collected, and how manageable will those data sets actually be. And sometimes less is more, and maybe it will be a matter of considering what is the best data to have. There may be certainly with blockchain and the likes, more accurate data certainly has the potential for that, and so again could be equally a very interesting way to develop and analyze data, and to use it for a greater good as well. So just some things for thought there. And just to say it, exciting times, but lots to consider too. So I'll pass to Leonie to see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lorna. And I think what's become clear over the course of this session is that the development of the metaverse will accelerate in the years to come, and that we're going to see a corresponding exponential rise in the related privacy issues. I think there's going to be some major challenges in applying existing laws and concept to this new area. And I think increasingly we're also likely to see continuing development in the regulatory sphere to address various new concerns. But as Lorna has pointed out, we're at the beginning of a new world. And so there are some unique opportunities here for businesses to make sure that they're getting it right from a privacy perspective from the very outset. And on that note, I'll just see if there's any questions. I believe, yes, we have a question around brands exploring the metaverse. Okay, so for brands exploring the metaverse, say for hosting a virtual event as a unique benefit for its paying subscribers, is the brand really a controller or even a processor here? It seems like the individual is really providing personal data to its hardware, the metaverse itself, and not the brand. If so, does the brand have any obligations other than disclosing that the individuals may be providing their data to these entities directly? Okay, great question. And I think, for even the most complex scenarios, I often say that we need to bring it back to first principles. And if we think about the definition of controllership, or what it means to be a data controller, we see that definition talks about the organization or the individual or the agency that alone or jointly with others determines the purposes and the means of processing. And we've had various case law also in the area to suggest that that doesn't necessarily mean even that you have to have access to the data. That could mean that somehow you're influencing the processing or having a say in the processing, notwithstanding that you're not even touching the data. So you're facilitating it somehow. And there's also, of course, the Wirtschaftsakademie case, which was the Facebook fan page case, which involved an individual setting up a fan page, being deemed to be a controller in his own right, because he was determining the purposes and the means of processing, while also providing the opportunity to provide data to other parties, including the social media provider. So I think, in short, it boils down to the extent to which any particular individual or organization or agency within the metaverse are involved in determining the purposes and the means of processing. So it could well be that, the brand in creating and hosting the virtual event is involved in determining the processing, because it's providing the opportunity for the collection of data, and providing the opportunity for others to collect the data. In a similar way, those others who are collecting the data and are involved in determining how the data is used are likely to be joint controllers with, the brand provider. I mean, that's looking at it at a very high level, but assuming that that's the factual situation. And also bearing in mind that the individual themselves, to the extent that they may be determining the purposes and means of processing of the data of other individuals, may also be controllers within the metaverse. So I think we potentially have a myriad of players, and that's where the challenges arise, because that's where we're going to have to get into, well, are these players acting as joint controllers? If they are, how are they going to arrange things between them with regard to dealing with data subject rights, providing the relevant notices, etc.? So I think, that's a really interesting question, because it gets to the heart of actually some of the key challenges that are posed by the metaverse. Okay, let's have a look at some of the other questions. Okay, I think this is probably one for you, Lorna. From a data protection point of view, what are the best things to start doing in terms of preparing for a presence in the metaverse?
Well, I think there's always time to do that data protection audit and just to see how your own housekeeping is, because I think, as we saw from what Natalie was saying, I think, there's a definite push for users to be controlling their own data more, but equally from what you've just said about brands there, and I think it's, we will definitely see organizations still collecting data, and there's a real need for that to be done too, because I think, there's so much benefit you can get from data analytics and things. And so, and also, some of us do want the consumer experience. So I think always to look at your own data protection processing and procedures as they are now. And as people will know, I have a very favorite specialism in accountability, and I think it's very important, which equally ties in with ethics. And I think there has been a wake-up call, just not just in terms of data protection, as we're seeing with climate change as well. And there's a responsibility, and I don't necessarily mean to put data protection in necessarily in kind of comparison to the climate change, which I'm sure people would consider far more serious. But personal data is intrinsic to the individual too, so there is importance in both. But I just think it's a matter of having, knowing what your procedures are, knowing what you want your strategy to be, how you can be compliant, and where your level of compliance is, and how you want to build consumer trust, how you want to engage your customers. And it could be your customer with commercial clients, or general customer, rather than consumer. So I think it's about finding your own level, and then looking at your processes and how innovative you are. As Natalie mentioned, the DPIAs, and just making sure everything is in line and is at the standard that you want it to be. As we know, data protection under the GDPR went to set a new benchmark, but again, companies are pressing on beyond that as well. So, that is the golden standard, but some are wanting to now be, platinum best practice. And I think there is a bit of a momentum shift. And so, for those who really want the icing on the cake, or maybe even the cherry, to blend in the ethics as well. So I think that's, not being overly ideal, but, we can press for high standards and see where we come out, because really with the metaverse and starting at this point, that it can be as ideal as we want to make it.
Great, thanks, Lorna. This one's probably for you, Natalie. You mentioned Web3. What is the difference between Web3 and the metaverse?
Good question. I will do my best to try and answer that. So yeah, I made reference to the metaverse being sort of powered by Web3 technologies, but and I think that those two concepts are often used quite interchangeably, and that's probably not correct, because certainly as I understand it, Web3 is being touted as the evolution of the internet. As we move from Web 2 to Web 3, the idea is that the internet and web is again based on decentralized ownership, as opposed to it being owned or monopolized by a small number of big players who shall remain unnamed. So there's a lot of focus when talking about Web3 on that being architected and supported by blockchain technologies, decentralized ledgers, and cryptocurrencies. So the metaverse is definitely a different thing, but is very much sort of based on technologies, power Web3 technologies and Web3 concepts. So I think there's definitely overlapped, and I think that the ultimate objectives of the future one all-encompassing metaverse that I was talking about at the beginning, it is definitely underpinned by the evolution of Web3. I think. I hope that tries to answer the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Natalie. That's clear. Right, we've got a really interesting one. Do the recent CJEU AG rulings on special category data mean that the metaverse will be unworkable in practice? Right, I'll take that one. So for those of you who haven't come across the recent CJEU rulings, one concerned a referral from the Lithuanian courts. Well, in fact, the CJEU decision concerned a referral from the Lithuanian court in relation to the publication of certain information online. So it was made available to the public. And that involved the publication of the gender of a particular individual and also of their partner. And the CJEU came to the conclusion that because of the possibility that inferences could be drawn about the sexual orientation of the individual via this, publication online, that meant the data essentially was special category data for the purposes of GDPR. The AG has recently, in another case, suggested something similar, that, there's data that's inherently sensitive, and there's also data which, on the face of it, from the face of it, you can make inferences in relation to certain other data, which would fall into the category of special category data. So I think, yes, most certainly those cases, if they continue to evolve in the direction that they appear to be heading, will cause significant challenges, not just for the metaverse, but more generally for different use cases across the board in different sectors. Arguably, the CJEU decision could be limited to its facts. It's not clear yet, to the ultimate effect of it. But I think, one of the questions might be, for example, in a metaverse context, to what extent that, an individual has manifestly made public the sensitive data in question, in the same way as they might manifestly make public via their social media profile their particular sexual orientation. And so to what extent, for example, it might be possible to comply with that special category data condition. The other issue might be is to what extent is the data being made public for the purposes of the particular metaverse use case, to allow other individuals to make inferences of special category data, and whether it makes a difference, for example, that certain technical and organizational measures have been put in place within the metaverse context to prevent those inferences being drawn. Now, it's difficult to comment on what that might look like without knowing the specific use case, but I think there's a number of different things to think about, but certainly it is an issue that requires consideration, not just in the metaverse context, more broadly. And it's a case, I think, at the moment of watch this space to see where these particular decisions are heading. Okay, we're coming quite close to time, so I think we probably have time for just one more question. Yes, and I think maybe this one might be for you, Lorna. Again, what data sharing arrangements will there be to manage interoperability between metaverses?
Well, whilst I'd like to know, I mean, a very interesting question, and whilst I'd like to know the answer myself, I think it will be a matter of depending on how the interoperability, which should be free flowing, will actually work. And maybe it will depend on the potential interoperability. And as I was perhaps giving the example earlier of taking my avatar from one metaverse to another, but then if I have different brands, it could be that you would need more than one data sharing agreement or a multi-party data sharing agreement. So are we going to see, beyond new categories of data, just new sharing arrangements as well? So I think, a kind of something to be determined, but also to think about. And I think there is guidance as well on data sharing. We know the ICO is looking at the metaverse, so will be interesting to see when either the ICO or the EDPB starts to have published documents on the metaverse. But again, best to focus on the existing data sharing agreements and knowing your data categories and things. But yes, definitely and knowing the data and what data. But I think as we've learned, the infrastructure of how that data will be collected, who will be collecting it, and who will be owning it, and maybe the companies will be going to the data subjects to ask for their data sharing, or perhaps that can just be done by the consumer freely giving that and their consent. So yes, I think they may get more sophisticated, but again, I think there's a lot to be determined before we start making a precedent.
Great, thanks very much, Lorna. And thank you very much to all our speakers today, Lorna, Jack and Natalie. I hope everyone's enjoyed the session. The recording and the slides will be made available after the event. And if you've got any further questions, then please feel free to reach out to us. But thank you very much for your attention.